to make sure that that your Zoom stuff doesn't show up on there. Zoom does some funny stuff with its own windows. Anyway, cool. So all of this stuff is kind of conventional layout for an Express project. And you can actually go and you can spin it up. You can see there's package.json. So to kick things off, you have to do an npm install. And that's sort of always the standard with a Node project. Anytime that you have a Node project, you have to start off by including whatever dependencies were given. Because you never know what might be needed in order to make the app run. Okay, so we've done that. So we can actually spin up the app with nodemon app.js. Go to localhost 3000. We can see the Pokedex app. Okay, so far so good. So we can look at set of Pokemon. We can even filter it. This is one of the reach features from the Express version of Pokedex. Clear the filter. I need to turn off Slack notifications. Okay, whatever, I'll do that later. So the show page works. You can edit. You can delete even. All right, so we have all the standard CRUD functionality for Pokedex. What we want to do in this assignment was two things. We wanted to change out our previous data storage system for Pokemon, which had been this DS object that I'd provided for you, and to use Mongoose instead. And then secondly, to implement authentication on this app so that users can actually have a relationship to Pokemon. Any given user can have caught some number of Pokemon, it can have seen some number of Pokemon, and you have access to that information. Okay, hang on one second, sorry. Cool, so, what was I gonna say? Oh yes, so that's what the relationship that's going to exist between users and Pokemon. We can see this in the README. So Pokemon still exist, but they're gonna be in Mongo. Gonna have users. The users are also gonna relate to Pokemon. They also need to have lists containing the Pokemon they've seen and Pokemon they've caught. There also should be some model validation, but we can get to that later. Okay, we could start with either of the two problems. We can start with either setting up Pokemon to be on Mongo, or we can start with auth. Either one is reasonable. I say, well, why don't we start with, let's start with auth. I know that most of you guys started with auth, so it probably makes the most sense to begin there. Just to pause for a second. You guys have any questions on things that I mentioned so far? I see lots of empty screens, which I assume means that you already know what I'm about to tell you and you don't need to hear this. Cool. Okay. So if we have our app, let's say that the first thing that we want to do is add authentication. Well, to add authentication, we need to add a couple new libraries. We need to add Express Session, we need to add Passport, we need to add Mongoose, and we also need Passport local Mongoose in order to get Passport to store its users in Mongoose. So I'm going to install a couple new packages, and I'm going to save them so that they get added to my package.json file, which is important if I want to share this project with somebody else. So I'm going to start Mongoose, passport, local Mongoose, and express session. Okay. So I can set some of that up in here. For instance, before I get to the express material, I can set up a section for Mongoose. Our Mongoose. Usually that's lowercase. What can we do with Mongoose? We can set the promise interface. Mongoose's promise will be the global promise. Cool. We need to set up a connection. Let's use a reference for that. How do we connect to a repo? Connect to a database, rather. So I might want to pull up an example in case I forget. Actually, the auth one's probably better. There is express sessions auth. Okay, perfect. Okay, so in that case, if I looked at app.js, I wanted to have mongoose.promise, and then I need to actually connect to the database. The way that you do that is with mongoose.connect. Let's call that database something else, though, maybe Pokedex. Okay, so we'll do that. And do we have everything else here? I believe we have body parser method override, Morgan. Yeah, so most of the other dependencies are already here. Nice. Okay, and then we need to have our passport stuff. So let's also add that. Put that in here. And this is all kind of standard boilerplate stuff. If I go back through, I'll probably just grab one of the example solutions. So it's right. App.use, passport initialize, app, blah, 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 blah. All of this kind of standard junk. And all of that is necessary in order to get that to work. Oh, and we got to set up express session, not just require it. Make that larger. In fact, we don't really need to store it anywhere, so we could just actually require it inside the app.use, require express session. Let's make our secret, it's a secret to everyone. Okay, so that sets up our session. Here we have passport and user. It's expecting a user model, so this isn't going to work until we actually put a user model in. But all of this stuff will take a user model that we configure correctly, and it'll set it up to work with passport so that we can have users authenticate. So if I then go over to my project again, I'm going to want to create a model for my user. So I'll call this user.js. And I go about creating that model. So var mongoose, let's require mongoose, var schema equals require or equals mongoose.schema rather. So var user schema equals new schema. And we define the schema here. So we saw from the README that there are a number of properties that a user needs to have, specifically things like username, password, created at, updated at. They need to have other properties too, but we can focus on that later. So username, blah. And so username is going to be a string. Password is going to be a string. Created at, it's going to be a date. And updated at is also going to be a date. Cool. All right, so we create the schema. Then we want to actually create the model. So we can say var user equals mongoose dot model. And export that user. That'll work just fine. Except for one thing. We also need to have the passport local mongoose. That is a necessary thing in order for this passport stuff to work. Things like create strategy and serialize user, deserialize user. These are not methods that a normal mongoose model has. They need to be added in, and the thing that does that is this, this library, passport local mongoose. And I don't remember if it's the model or the schema. It is the schema. Okay. Actually, that should be camel case, not Pascal case. Okay, so you can load passport local mongoose as a plugin for the user schema, and then you can create your model. And this could really be here. We don't need to store that in a variable here. There's no need really. So if we do this, if we take what we've done so far, that means that we have a mongoose model for a user. And they have their own properties, but specifically username and password. Those are the critical ones. And we load passport local mongoose in order to give our user model some additional methods that we can use as part of this authentication process. So we create our user and we export it. Okay, so from app.js, once we've set up express session and we've required passport and user and so on, so this sets up passport to work with our app. And then we say, hey, passport, here's how you should work. And so we say users create strategy method. This is defined inside the library, the passport local mongoose, and it's added to the user model in that way. So that's how these methods come to be. Okay, so with this, we now have the machinery in place to do authentication, at least in terms of authenticating a user and so on. Let's go ahead and actually make this work within our application. Well, first of all, let's test to see that we didn't break everything. Okay, so we have a crash. Resave is false. Oh, yep, looks like I forgot to include comma. Starting node app.js. And this really shouldn't change anything about the application at the moment. We haven't integrated user at all into the app, so nothing about this is going to be any different. Okay, so let's go ahead and add the ability to sign up, say. Okay, so to sign up is to create a new user. We're going to need to have a form in order to do that. We can put the form on the home page, or we could put the form in here inside the this header. That would work also. Let's try it over here. Why not? So div. And this will be my my register form. Oh, this is a class register. And since we're going to want to have a form to log out, let's put that here also. So we'll have 3 forms. Actually, I'll need to kill and restart NodeMon because it doesn't detect changes to the handlebars. I inspect the elements in the page. There's my div, and there's 3 forms. Great. Okay. Now, in the register form, we're going to want a couple of fields. So we'll have an input username, input called password, and we'll have a submit button. Okay. So now we have a little form here. We could choose to style this differently, but I'll worry about that later. Cool. Okay. Login form is going to have pretty much the same content, but instead of registering, it'll be log in. And log out is just going to be a log out button. Cool. So we have our forms. They look kind of cruddy, but that's okay. We don't really care. Assuming that we have our forms and that they're being served, well, okay, so I'll mention that because we're putting this into the layout, things that appear in the layout are going to appear on every page. So if I go to browse the index, those forms are still visible. They're there on every page because I said that's, you know, it goes into the layout and layout appears on every page. So there we go. Even if I go to an individual Pokemon's page, if I go to their show page, forms still there because they're in the layout. Purpose of the layout. Purpose of the layout is to just contain things that are visible on every page. Okay. So if I go home, I have these forms and I want to be able to use them to do stuff. Well, naturally, right? In order to be able to respond to the requests from a form, I need to have things that handle requests, which means routers. So I'm going to need to be able to handle requests at routes that relate to authentication. There's a couple different ways to do this, and I did it differently in the official solution than I'm about to do it. Rather than putting it in either index.js or Pokemon.js, I'm going to create an entire new controller called auth.js. And I'll start it out just the same. No, frozen. Okay, there we go. Oh, I see. So we have auth.js, which is going to be its own separate router, and we'll export that router. Why have a separate router for auth? Well, or controller, I should say, in this case. The purpose of a controller is to handle a specific type of request. The requests related to authentication are actually kind of different than the requests that relate to showing pages or performing CRUD on Pokemon. So it kind of does make sense to give it its own special place. And we can figure out the URL for that. But if we want to keep it simple, we could actually just have app.use auth. And now we have a controller that's dedicated to doing authentication. We don't need to really worry about what this URL is though, because the forms are actually not being served up by those routes. The forms are being served up by these two controllers on those views. So we're never actually going to be visiting /auth unless we want to. We don't have to. So we can just have that be a place that we make requests to from a form, but don't actually visit. Okay, let's create a sign up route. So I can say router.post because I know it's going to be a post request. And let's say that I want it to be at register, right? That's reasonable. I might want it to be at register. Okay. So inside here, I'm going to want to register a new user. Let's refer back to the auth homework. When we wanted to create a new user there, what we did is we said user.register. This is a method that was added by Passport Local Mongoose. And it allows us to create a new user and simultaneously have it be set up with all the authentication stuff. So I can put that all in here. We don't need favorite book or favorite color anymore. But username is going to be rec.body.username. And created at and updated at, these are just going to be the moment when we create this user. Because at that moment, it's going to be a specific moment in time. And for future updates, we'll change this value, but created at will always just stay the same. So this is going to be our new user. We're registering this user along with a given password. And then we have an error function. And if we fail, what actually happens? According to the spec, if we attempt to register, registration is always successful. So in that case, we're automatically redirecting them to /. Perfect. Okay. Let's check to see whether this code works. So here's our register form. Actually, I'm going to bring the this window down here while we do this. So here's our register form. I'm going to create a new user. Oh, before I do that, let me make sure that I empty my database. Well, I'll do that later. All right, so I'm going to create a brand new user. I'm pretty sure this one doesn't exist. And I'm going to call it Ash because this is a Pokedex app. So that'll be the username and password. It's not hidden yet. We didn't specify that, but that's also a UI thing, and we can go and change that later pretty easily. So we're going to create a new user. How about that? Ash Ketchum. There we go. So that'll be the credentials for this particular user. So let's see what happens if we try to register. Not quite. We attempted to make a get, and it went to the wrong URL. That means that we didn't do something quite right with our form. So we'll need to define the method and the action, which in this case is /auth, right? Because we defined our auth router to be listening at /auth /register. Okay, so if we refresh, we try again. Let's try and register with these credentials now. Okay, we hit an error. User is not defined. Oh, right. We used user inside this router, but we didn't actually include it in this file. We did include it in app.js because we needed it in order to configure Passport correctly, but we didn't include it here. So let's include that now. Okay, so we'll go back. But we know that that's a good sign, right? Because it means that it did, in fact, hit the route that we were looking for it to hit. So that's cool. All right, so restarted, clear that away, and I'll try one more time to register, and we'll see if it works. Post auth register, get 200. And it looks like we did, in fact, create a user with the username Ash. Awesome. So that's the register piece of our authentication puzzle. We have two other pieces that we need to account for, log in and log out. So let's do log in next. Both of these things relate to log in and log out, both relate to authentication as well. So let's also handle them in this same router. So I get a post to /login, or /auth/login, I should say. I can log in at that point. Now with this one, for login, remember I need to do the whole passport.authenticate local thing. Remember that? Pause sharing for a minute. Is this ringing any bells for folks that we have to do the passport authenticate local when we do login? Cool. Now, in order to do that, we're going to need passport, which means I already know I need to require it. So I'll require passport from this file. Okay. And you know what, let's just refer back. I mean, there's no reason not to look back at past work we've done. If I log in, passport authenticate, rec res, and then I create a session. So let's break this apart for a minute. rec.session.save. .save kind of implies that we're putting something into memory, and we sort of are. And we're also giving a callback. So if the save process fails, then we have an error. Okay. So we can have this here, although I don't know why that's next. There aren't any other callbacks associated with this. So in this case, maybe we would just console the error. Well, okay, we'll leave that for now. And then we find the user. Do we want to do that? We haven't specified what we want to do once we've logged in yet. This is the part that's actually going to log us in. Logging in from the perspective of this application means creating a session. So in our README, what does it say we should do if we log in? They fill out and submit the login form, and if the user successfully authenticates, the user is signed in by creating a session. Okay, we got that. The user is redirected to home. Home. Do I have a right for home? That might be a mistake in the README. But the home route. So it's not /home. Yeah, that is a mistake. So rather than /home, that should say /. A sign out button appears in the header of every page. So we see the sign out button. If we don't successfully authenticate, we get redirected to /also. Why don't we make this Pokemon? Because I think that was what was originally intended here. So we'll redirect to Pokemon if we authenticate successfully, and we'll redirect to home if we don't. Doesn't really matter much. So in that case, we can go to auth.js and we can say, if it was successful, if it was not successful, then we redirect. And we redirect to slash. Otherwise, you redirect to slash Pokemon. Cool. So if we're able to save that successfully, then we'll redirect to slash Pokemon. If we fail, we'll redirect to slash. If we're able to log in. Let's test it out. So no advance in restarting this as we've been making these changes. I'm going to refresh the browser as well. And let's go ahead and say, I've just created the credentials already, Ash Ketchum. So I've created those credentials. So I am going to log in.
Hey, Matt.
Yep.
I don't see you typing anything. I got stuck on your screen with the out, but yeah. Okay, now everything is back.
How long has that been out? When was the last thing that you guys saw? Sorry about that. I must have hit pause share. Forgotten to unpause it. Okay, this is what I just created. So I already had register working. And when register was working, I was creating a new user. And then when I was done, it's redirecting to slash. Actually, I don't even need that. I redirect to slash every time. Okay, so that's my register process is happening inside the auth controller. And then I have my login process, which is also happening in that same controller. Let me pause for a second. Can I get a quick thumbs up from you guys that this is okay and that this is making sense? Just come on camera for a second.
My camera is broken, but yeah.
Okay, that's fine. So you're good, Zarella, Jesse, Brad, Sean. Cool. Okay. Just double checking. It's a little hard to know exactly who's listening in. Guys should feel free to jump in with questions. Seriously, if at any point I'm doing something that confuses you or that doesn't make sense, please jump in.
Okay, I have a question.
Yep, awesome, thank you.
For the register part, I have the passport authenticate in there too. It seemed to work, but I guess it was not necessary. It was just necessary for the login part. So
when you give something in here after you say like the path and before you give this final callback, this stuff in here, this is called middleware. It's called middleware because it's in the middle of this and this. Okay. Sort of. That's not quite exactly what middleware means, but that's sort of what it means. It's stuff that happens along the way that you can sort of just plug in. So in this case, sorry, there's a lot of background noise. In this case, if you want to authenticate, that is to say to check your credentials before you do something, then you can put passport authenticate local at that point, and it will run that code to check the credentials and potentially, if it's successful, create a new session. Okay. Once we've created the session, we no longer need to do this because we'll have rec.user. Rec.user only exists once we've authenticated. So we can look to rec.user to tell us whether or not we've authenticated successfully. Okay. But the register in particular, you would actually not want that because when you're registering, presumably you are not logged in. and you don't have credentials of your own because you're new, right?
Yeah.
Passport.authenticate local is checking your credentials, which are coming along for the message. And if you don't have an entry in the database, when you try and check for it, it will say, no, we don't have a record of you in the database, therefore you can't come in.
Okay, cool. I don't know if that maybe was my issue when I was trying to do my register, but that's good to know.
Yeah. So that should go on the login route, not on the register route. Register needs to be open because you don't have credentials yet.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Very welcome. Okay, we have register, we have login. Does it actually work? Let's try it. So if I decide to use my credentials that I created last time, I think it should be a U, and I attempt to log in, no, it's saying get username as password Ketchum. We're making the wrong type of request. That means that we need to go and take a look at our form. And in fact, our login form is also missing some of that extra information that we need. We need to tell the form that it needs to make a post request, not a get request. And it needs to make it to specifically /auth/login. So now when we submit the login form, it's going to make that kind of request to that specific location. Okay. So let's say that I do that. Cannot post.
You miss an equal sign on the action.
Thank you very much. That's exactly right. There you are. Okay, let's try that again. I don't know why that's like not consistent about how wide it stays. Strange. Anyway, let's go ahead and try and log in now. Okay, so we created a session and Passport says, here's our user, Ash. And at the end of it, it redirected me to /Pokemon. Cool. We could have it redirected to some other place. That doesn't really matter. Cool. So now we're logged in. We have a session. Now we just need to handle log out. So for log out, we're going to want that to be not a post, a delete request. And because that would be the appropriate convention for deleting a session, right? So logging out, really easy. We just say log out, and then we redirect. According to the README, if they log out, the user is signed out. It doesn't actually specify. The guy who wrote these specs was not sufficiently detailed. Okay, well, let's say that it takes us to home again. Okay, I think that's right, rec.logout. Double check that. Yep, rec.logout, perfect. So if I am here, then if I send a delete request to /logout, it's going to delete my current session. So how do I send a delete request? Well, with the form. Here, the method is going to need to be post, but we're going to do method override. And so that's going to need to be at auth/logout. I believe that's correct. Fact check me, does that look right? For the form action? Oh, we can check in the view. Log out, I'm just going method delete. Question mark. Yep, okay, cool. That's all right. So this will make a delete request by way of method override to auth/logout, which means that it will get picked up over here. It should get picked up over here. But let's test it just to be sure. Okay, so I'm going to log in with some credentials that I know work. So it created a session. And now I'm going to hit log out. Cool. It logged me out and it redirected me back to home. Nice. Okay. Cool. That's it. We have auth. We haven't done much with it, but we have authentication. We can create users, we can log in, and we can log out. So that handles a lot of the issues that we have. We can also add some UI functionality. So for example, if we were to say in layout, maybe we want to have an if in here. Say if is logged in, then we see a logout form. Else we see register login. Okay, so if we were to pass in some property, is logged in, true or false, whatever that would be, however we would define that to be, if it's true, this form, the logout form, will be visible, and if it's false, the register and login forms will be visible. Okay, so let's say that we were looking at, well, we have kind of a couple different routes that show things, right? We have the home route, we have the index, we have the show for the Pokemon, and we have the new and the edit. So let's take a look at our Pokemon route. We're going to need to add some extra information when we render those views in order for this to show up properly. We need to be able to indicate whether or not somebody is or is not logged in. So let's pull up the Pokemon controller. Here we have some view data, and look, title. This is a property that's not part of the Pokemon index route. Title doesn't appear anywhere here. Rather, title is something that appears on layout. See? So if we want something to appear in layout, it's just as if it was in our normal template, which means that we also need to make is logged in available in the same way. So if this is our view all Pokemon page, let's add some data. Specifically, we'll say is logged in. Now, are they logged in? Well, how do we know if they're logged in? We know if there is a rec.user. If rec.user exists, if this is truthy, is logged in is going to be true. Otherwise, it'll be false. We could probably get by saying just rec.user and let the template worry about truthy falsy. But generally speaking, I try to avoid putting too much data into the template. You never know what sorts of things might pop up by accident. So let's just make it so that the template only shows true or false for that value. Okay, so is logged in, true, false. And so we're on the show Pokemon page right now. And look, only 2 of the forms are visible, register and log in. If I log in with my known credentials, both of those 2 forms disappear, but the logout form becomes visible. If I log out, those 2 forms become visible again. Cool. It's a relatively simple way of adding that kind of nice extra functionality to the app. I'm going to put this in a couple more controllers. So I'm going to say, in addition to title being Pokedex, we'll have an is logged in here. And I'll also put it on the new page. On the show page. And on the edit page too. That's also one where that's going to appear. Okay, so here I am on the home page. If I go to the Pokemon index, you can see I only see the 2 forms, even though 3 were put into the template. Same here on the show, or even on the edit page. Make it a little smaller because of Zoom. Make that even smaller because of Zoom. So if I go to the edit page, also on the edit page, register login. If I log in, Ash Ketchum, suddenly I'm logged in and things look different. I only see the logout on any page I go to. Okay, cool. We pretty much have auth well in hand right now. We're authenticating, we're making decisions based on whether or not we are logged in. Let's change gears. We're going to stop talking about authentication because that's pretty much done at this point. We have our auth controller handling authentication-related requests. And we have our views updated with a little bit of extra information. So let's go on to the second part of our mission, which is to refactor our code so that rather than using the data store version of these Pokemon, that we're using MongoDB instead. There are a couple of reasons why that makes a lot of sense. If I make changes to values of data store and then I kill NodeMon and restart it, all of those changes disappear. But putting it in Mongo means that I'll be able to run that and it's being stored in a separate place and it exists independently of the Express app. Okay, so in order to do that, I need to have a model. I'm going to create a new model called Pokemon.js. And because I'm productively lazy, I'm going to copy all of this information from user.js. I don't need passport local mongoose. That's only for authentication related things. But I'm going to call this Pokemon schema. This is going to be called Pokemon. And I'm going to add all the properties of a Pokemon. Now I know all of those. already because we have them from the data store. But I can add them again here. Name, NPN, region, types, description. So we have a name, string, NPN, which is a number. We have a region, which is a string. We have type 1, which is a string. Type 2, which is a string. And any other properties? Description, right? Which is also a string. Cool. That's actually pretty much it. Now we have a Pokemon schema. Pause this for just 1 second. I got a knock on the door. Okay, I've picked up the recording again, and let's reshare the screen. So here is the Pokemon schema. We've created that, and now we have a Pokemon model, which we're exporting. We have a Pokemon schema, and we have our Pokemon model, which we export from the Pokemon.js file. Okay, we can go ahead and start making CRUD routes, but before we do, I'd actually like to just start populating the Mongo database with data. The data store, right, just having this doesn't automatically do that. I'm going to go ahead and create a scripts directory. It should actually go here. Because I want to write a script to do something for my, my app. I'm going to say populate example Pokemon.js. And what I'm going to do with this script is I'm going to get all of the Pokemon data from my data store. I don't need to copy that over. The data store already has it, right? So I'm going to get all of that information, and I am going to add those Pokemon to the database. So this is actually going to be kind of similar to what we did last week during our Mongoose and promises stuff. Because right now we're operating outside of the context of the Express app. So all the Express stuff that we had going on, that's no longer here. Cool. So we can say mongoose.connection, or .connect, excuse me. And it's HTTP localhost. It's not HTTP. What is it? MongoDB, of course. Cool. So that's going to connect to the Pokedex. And I'm also going to create a value called DB, which is going to be equal to the connection. The reason I do that is that whenever I finish whatever operations I'm doing, I'm going to want to call db.close so that I can ensure that the database connection over here gets closed. I'm done. Right? Cool. So the first thing that I want to do here is I'm going to pull in the data from lib. So I can say var ds equals acquire lib and then data store.js. Is it clear why I'm doing this? Would anyone like me to stop and explain that? This is not part of the Express app exactly, but it's something that is related to the app. It's like I want to be able to automatically create some set of Pokemon in the database before I even get started.
Is this kind of like when we did the seeds for testing purposes?
Yeah, kind of. Seed
Okay.
is a bit of a loaded term. Strictly speaking, a seed or seed data is data that needs to exist inside your application in order for the application to run at all. For example, if you were doing something that involved sending deliveries and you needed to send things all across the United States, if you didn't have, say, information on states, if you didn't have all of the United States listed, your app would not be able to work at all. So that is seed data. It's data that your application must have in order to function.
Oh, I thought it was just for testing purposes, but okay.
It's a
That makes sense.
common misconception. So if you say seed data in a typical conversation, you won't get funny looks. But you're quite right.
Okay.
So speaking, seed data is the minimum data that you need in order to run. It's what's the term that I'm looking for? It's a production minimum data. This is just example filler data. And you can write as many different scripts as you want for this. You could have multiple different scripts for testing out different examples of data. You can say, oh, I want to test, here's with 5 Pokemon, or here's 50 Pokemon, or here's Pokemon from 1 to 100, and here's Pokemon from 500 to 750, or whatever. You can make as many of these scripts as you want just to play around with what you're doing with the app. But the concept is right, Zara. I don't want to mislead you on that. You're correct.
Okay.
What we're doing is we're creating some test data inside our application so that we can test it out and see if it's working.
Okay, cool.
If our app were different, if it presupposed that all 150 Pokemon, all 150 original Pokemon were loaded into the database, and then users were just interacting with those, then in that case, that might be seed data, because it needs to exist in the application in order for the app to work. But in this case, we're CRUDing Pokemon, we're creating new ones, we're deleting them. And so because of that, we don't really need to have some set of Pokemon pre-existing. We can just create them on the fly.
Okay, thank you, that makes sense.
Cool. So I'm gonna say example Pokemon is ds.getAllPokemon. And that's going to give me an array of all of the Pokemon that existed in data store. Okay. Now I need to interact with the Mongoose database, or with the Mongo database through Mongoose is what I should say. In order to do that, I need to require the model. Once I have the model, I can write commands that will manipulate this database, or this collection within the MongoDB database. Since this is a script, and you might want to run a script multiple times, what thing might we want to do first, just to start off? Give you a hint. It's something that we did in the Mongoose homework to start things off.
What was the question again?
Yeah, so this is a script, right? Which means that we're going to want to be able to run it multiple times, potentially, change it, run it again. It's not necessarily something that runs once and then never more. So because of that, what might be a good idea for our first step?
Drop the content of the database?
Yes. Empty out anything that was in there before. So we're going to start this off with Pokemon.remove. And this will clear out any existing Pokemon from the database. And then we can just add back each one of the Pokemon. Now there's only 6 of them, so this is pretty easy. We can just have 6.dens. So we'll say, and let's say, example Pokemon 0.
Can it be done in a loop? Since
However, it gets a little bit more complicated. So what happens is if you try to do it in a loop, you have difficulty making sure that each stage waits for the next stage to finish. Maybe that's not important. In this case, you could argue, I think, that maybe it's not important and you just iterate through them all and create them. You might not create them in the order that you expect, but that's not necessarily a problem. So yeah, you could make the case, I think, in this specific example, that you have then, and then say Pokemon.create. Actually, you would just say example Pokemon dot for each. And then you would say Pokemon.create. That. This is fine. It will create all the Pokemon. It won't preserve any sort of order. So if that order is important for whatever reason, then this approach is not going to be reliable. You don't necessarily know which of these calls to Pokemon create is going to finish first. Again, in this case, in this specific example, probably not an issue, but in some cases it will matter. So in that case where order is important, you can stage it as a sequence of promises. And then once you're done, you can call db.close. Is that still down there somewhere? I can't see because the zoom bar is, yeah, it's still there. So as a last step, when you're done working around with the database, you can call db.close, and that'll close the connection. We can also throw a catch in here if we want to catch any errors that might pop up at any point along the chain. Okay, and what this is going to do is it's just going to create all of those. There is another way, though, that we can do it. And it involves something that I haven't taught you guys, but is something that's rather cool. I'll show it to you, but I don't want you to repeat it because you haven't really had any experience with it so far. There's another way of writing promises that are running in parallel as opposed to in series. And it's called promise.all. Promise.all expects an array of promises, and you can call .then on it, and it'll return you an array of the results of each of those promises. And this .then callback will only fire when all of the promises in the array have finished, either successfully or unsuccessfully. So that's something neat that you can do with promises, and it's a little harder to imagine if you're not using promises, if you're using callbacks or something like that. So here's how that might work in a situation like this. Again, don't copy this. This is just to show you some of the world that's out there. We have example Pokemon. So let's take example Pokemon, and we'll map each Pokemon to a promise. If we do this, then what we're dealing with here, what this is going to return, is an array of promises. Each Pokemon in the array being mapped to a promise. So if that's an array of promises, then what we can do is we can say return promise.all . And this is our array of promises. We give it to promise.all. And whatever comes next, right, will get fired after all of the promises complete. And if we wanted to, we could do something like this. So just say console.log hypothetically, if we wanted to do other steps in that process. But again, this is something that you guys have not seen, not something, God, that I would expect you guys to know. But it is something really cool and powerful that you can do with promises that's a lot harder to do in other contexts. But let's keep it like this for now. This is a fairly straightforward way to do it. It's the brute force approach, and the brute force approach is hardly ever wrong. So we'll do that. And then we will end our script. Now to run this thing, if we're in this directory, we can say node, because that's how we run a JavaScript file, scripts/populate example Pokemon. Let's see if it works. It seems to have worked. It would have been perhaps smart to include a .then to show all the Pokemon that exist. And the nice thing is we can actually run this script again, having modified it, because the first thing that the script does is just delete the whole set of Pokemon records. So we don't run into any trouble by running this twice. There we go. So we've just created 6 Pokemon in the database. We could actually check them if we wanted to go to Mongo Pokedex. Oh, this is from running one of your guys' assignments. So if I were to say db.pokemons.find, the reason it's Pokemons is because Pokemon, it assumes, is singular, and so it just adds an S. Little do they know that's the same, singular and plural. But okay, here we have all of our Pokemon in the database, and they've been added by our script. Cool. Now we've got some stuff to work with. If we go into the controller for Pokemon, now we just need to swap out a lot of the stuff from being just grabbing DS to actually grabbing it from Mongoose. So if this is what we had before, rather than getting all Pokemon from DS, we can say Pokemon.find all .exec .then we can say view data. Well, actually, we can just copy this. A lot of it anyway. And the filtering stuff that goes on with search string, we could actually run that before it even gets here. We could say .then and we can say var search string equals rec.query.search string. It's just an extra piece of information that this filter passes along when it requests that page. And so if there is a match, it attempts to keep it. And we'll say return Pokemon.filter. Call it POC. Filter, and we'll keep the ones where the name of the Pokemon in lowercase includes the search string in lowercase. That's what makes it case insensitive. We just say we're going to take both times, no matter what it was, and we'll make it lowercase, so we don't care about what it was to begin with. We could also do this with a regular expression if we wanted to. But Pokemon filter is going to return the list of Pokemon for which this condition is true. On the other hand, we might not pass a search string. So if we don't have a search string, we can just pass through all the Pokemon. But if search string does exist, then we pass through the filtered list. What's kind of nice about then, in addition to the obvious benefits for dealing with async, is that it kind of nicely allows you to break up the different stages even of a fast process. So we can kind of totally separate the process of filtering the Pokemon from the process of setting up our view. Okay, so we're refactoring now, which means that we have to be careful not to break stuff. I've commented out the original code rather than deleting it. So let's actually go to the route. It looks like Node is saying that the app is still working, which is good. Okay, so I'm going to go home. I'll have to log in again. Well, actually, I don't, but whatever. View data is not defined. Line 22. Oh, forgot to comment this out. There we go. Go back, log in. Pokemon is not defined. Oh, right. And we need to obviously have our model if we want to do things with it. So let's require that model. Models / Pokemon.js. And we'll try it again. So much trial and error, right, guys? You gotta test it, and then you see if it works, and then it doesn't work, and like, okay, why didn't it work? All right, now this is interesting. We're hanging. That means that for whatever reason, things didn't get resolved. The only reason that would happen in this case is if we hit an error, because we have a res.render inside the then. But if there's an error along this chain, it's going to skip the .thens and run until it hits a catch. So let's add a catch in here. Where if we have an error, we can console.log that error. So it's an error in the Pokemon router with the index action. It's the term action. So the app crashed. Missing a paren after the argument list. Yeah, missing a comma actually. Okay, there we go. So now let's try it again. I'm going to try logging in again. Okay. Reference error. All Pokemon is not defined. Looks like I made an error in my refactoring. Let's take a look. Aha! Yes, I did. I forgot to change this when I modified it. This should be Pokemon because that's the name of what's coming in from that promise. Okay. So let's go back to home. I'm going to try logging in again. Hey, and now everything worked successfully. I'm here and I see the list of Pokemon. Now the rest of the stuff, the rest of the actions and so on should all work because I haven't modified them. But I did modify this one. And it's almost time for outcomes, so I'm going to stop here. But do you guys sort of have an idea now of how to proceed with this kind of an app?
Yes.
Does this clear things up?
Yeah, it clear. At least for me, it cleared up the concept.
Yeah. They're separate problems. Authentication is one problem, and dealing with the rest of your app is another. As much as possible, try and solve those two problems separately before you bring them together. In this case, you can see that we're doing stuff. We're doing CRUD with Pokemon, but we haven't touched users at all. We will eventually, because one feature that we need to incorporate with users is that users need to keep track of the Pokemon that they have seen and caught, right? That is another feature, and we haven't gotten to it yet, but we don't need to, not yet. We can focus just on being able to CRUD with Pokemon, refactoring the Pokemon controller so that it uses the Pokemon model rather than data store. Cool. I have a fully worked out solution for this. It's up if you want to take a look at it, but it follows along more or less these lines. I didn't do it exactly the same way. This time I created an auth controller, which I think is actually a better idea than what I did before, which was keep it all in the index controller. Keeping it separated just makes more sense. It does something different than the index controller and the Pokemon controller. And there's no reason that it has to be in the same file as any of the others. So you can kind of keep track of it more easily. You have less going on. Easier to set up, easier to fix. With that, I'm going to stop the recording.